Today we're going to use the recipes that we created in the previous tutorial to set up the controller and actions and views to allow a user to create and manage his or her list of recipes. This is the actual task from the backlog that we're going to be working on today, and it's going to cover a lot in terms of views, and we're going to have to write quite a bit of markup, but we're not going to make things specifically look pretty. We're going to structure it in such a way that we can actually build out on top of it later, but for the most part today we just want to make sure that all of these interactions can work. So we need to be able to display all of the recipes that a user has, an individual recipe that a user has, let them create new ones, edit existing ones, and delete old recipes. Before we really get started, we're going to go ahead and make some directories for ourselves. So we need to have the app views recipes directory to put all of our new views into. And then we need to set up our controller too. So if we come back to Atom and we take a look in app controllers, we need to set up a new one in here. It's going to be the recipes, plural, controller. So class recipes controller. This inherits from application controller. And we're not going to put anything in it just yet. And then we want to set up our routes too. So if we go to config routes, we want to set up resources for recipes. And this specific function or method, and passing it the symbol here, will set up all of the routes that we're going to do today. So this is all of your basic CRUD routes. So that's index, show, edit, update, new, create, and destroy. Save that. If we come back over and we start a Docker container for our running application, we can check out our rake routes and make sure that we have this in here. So you see all these /recipes routes now. We're going to, over the course of this tutorial, create all of these individual methods. To get started, we're going to work on the index one, which will list out all of the recipes that a user might have. So for that, we're going to create a new file in the recipes called index.html.erb, and the name corresponds to the action that we're going to be implementing. These are going to be simple, remember, so this will just say recipes. And then down here, we're going to have a class for recipes. And then we want to list through recipes. So we're going to say @recipes for this instance variable. And for each of these, we're going to pop off a recipe. And for each one, we'll set up another div. And this is going to be a class of recipe, just so we can style this really easily later on. And inside of here, we're going to have a few things. So we're going to have an h3 that we're going to put the name of, and we're going to make it a link too. So we're going to have a recipe.name, and then it's going to go to the recipe path for this particular recipe. Then we're going to have a paragraph that's going to have the description in it. And lastly, we're going to have some links that the user can click. So we're going to call these recipe actions. We want one for editing. So we'll just say edit. This is going to go to the edit recipe path for the recipe. And then we want another one that's going to be for deleting. This one's going to be a little bit more complicated, so it's going to be go to the recipe path for the recipe. But additionally, it's going to do some more stuff. So we're going to have it give a confirmation. So confirm with, are you sure you want to delete? And then we'll put the recipe details in here too. So the recipe name. And then outside of this hash, we're going to say that the method is delete. And I'll explain all of this here in a second. So if we save that, that's the entire thing. And going through here, let's just take a look. So this is in Ruby, it's basically the Ruby for loop. We don't use for very often. And this at recipes is going to come from our controller. So our index action's main job is actually just going to be to set this up. And then you'll notice in ERB that there are two different ways that we wrote this. We wrote less than %, and then we wrote less than % equals. And this equals bit means that if you put this here, then whatever is actually the final result of the expression in here will be put into the page. Otherwise, it won't be. So we don't want the output of the each method to be the thing that we are putting into the page. We want the contents of the block. Whereas right here, we actually want to take the string that is the recipe's description and put it into the paragraph tag. Moving on down, we have these we called recipe path, edit recipe path again. And these actually come from our routes. So if we bounce back over and we look at our routes, you can see this stuff right here. So new recipe, edit recipe, recipes. If you append an underscore path or an underscore URL to any of these are what are called path helpers inside of Rails. Looking at this delete link, what this actually does is it renders out a link, and then it sets up some data attributes. So this data confirm means it's going to pop up with a confirmation dialog box that's going to require you to hit yes. And then this method means we're going to actually submit this link through Ajax or via JavaScript and use the HTTP method of delete. And this is required in order to get to the destroy action. So if we come back and look at our routes again, you'll see that this delete, all capitals here, it goes to the same URL as the actual show for a recipe, but it hits a different method. So that's what this is about over here, is we're saying we need to have a link that you can click and it's going to submit something over the delete HTTP method. So let's go and see what we've got if we go into our browser. If we go to localhost 3000 and then we go to recipes, you'll see that we don't actually have recipes to work with just yet. So we need to add that to our controller. So we'll create our def index, and this will pull in the recipes by getting recipe.all. Whoop. Save that and refresh this page. I apparently mistyped something. Yes, recipes. Save it again. Refresh the page. Okay, this is great, except for the fact that we don't have anything. And the reason for this is there's nothing in our database. So thankfully, Rails gives you a tool for seeding your database or adding fake data to your database when you first get started. And this is great if you're working on a team and you need to onboard somebody new. And it's good to have some fake data that they can work with to kind of get their bearings with what's going on in the application. And it even gives you a rake task in order to do this for you. So all these things go into the db/seeds.rb file. And we're going to set that up in a second. But one thing that we want is to have our data be a little bit more realistic in the sense that it's not the same word for everything. So we can use factory girl like we did in the previous tutorial to create recipes, but we want it to create recipes that have unique information about them because they can't have the same name, remember. So we're going to use a gem called faker, which you can find at stympy/faker on GitHub. And what this does is it gives you a bunch of different things here that you can call faker, whatever the module is, and some sort of saying, and it will give you a bunch of random strings, or you can have it give you dates and times. So this is really useful if you just need fake data to work with in your application. I recently found that they have faker hipster, and so this is actually what we're going to use to create our recipe names and the descriptions. So the first thing we need to do is actually get this in our application though. So if we go back to our gem file, we're going to put this in the development test area. So we'll just gem faker. Now we have to go through the basic role of shutting down our container, rebuilding, and spinning those back up. Docker compose stop app, and Docker compose build, and Docker compose upd. We'll exec back into our container now. Okay, the first thing we want to do with faker is we want to take our recipe factory that we had from the previous tutorial and rig it up to use faker. So the way we're going to do that is by going into test factories and going to the recipes one. And when you call this name method and you give it this string, what happens is it always sets it to this one, but it only calls this stuff once. So if you want what's called a lazy attribute, you put these inside of a block. and then whatever is called in here, it'll call this block every single time that you try to create a new recipe using the factory. So this is where we want to put our call to faker hipster dot sentence. And then down here for description, we're going to do the same thing. So we'll say faker hipster, whoops. And then this one will be a paragraph, just to make it a little longer, like our description should be. Beautifully, in our previous test, we never actually made any sort of assertion about the content of our name or description, so we didn't actually break our tests, even though we just changed our factories. Now we need to go and actually create our seeds file. So if we go to DB and then go to seeds, it tells you kind of some things you can do in here. I'm just going to delete all this. And one of the things it doesn't tell you to do is rig up your seeds file to not run outside of development. This is kind of important if you do seeds the way that I'm about to show you. So we're going to exit if the Rails environment is not development. And the reason for this is because when I run seeds, I like it to delete all the data that already exists and then rebuild it back up. So we're going to have it delete the data, and this will call recipe.deleteAll and user.deleteAll. And then additionally, we'll have it create our user for us. So this will store this off as user and say factory girl create user, and then the email, we're going to specify the email so that we can always use this one to actually sign into our application. And then it'll also create recipes. So we'll have it create 20, and this will do factory girl dot create recipe, and then we can specify that it's associated to the user that we're going to be using. So if we save that and come back to our terminal and we run rake db seed, whoops, I actually had a typo in there. That's time is not quite right. There we go. Save that, run it again. You can see that it deleted the data, created the user, and then created the recipe. So now if we come back over, close that tab, and we refresh this recipes page, it's going to go and fetch all of the recipes. And it displays them pretty nicely, actually. So we have a clickable heading that's going to take you to recipe/1 for this particular one based on the ID, recipe/2. Edit will take you to recipes to edit, and delete will point at this too. So we have everything we really need here in order to get up and running. We did forget to add a link to actually create our new recipes though. So let's go add that now. So if we go back to our index, we'll just put this in a div, nothing fancy, and we'll use our link to again for new recipe and give it the new recipe path. And this doesn't take a recipe because no recipe exists just yet for this. So there we go. So now we have a new link. If we come back and we refresh this, we should see, yeah, now there's a new one that we can take to go get to the form to actually build out a new one. All right, one action down, only 5 or 6 more to go. So the next one we're going to work on is actually the show action. So that's when you click on this link, it's going to take you to a page and show you the details for this individual recipe. So first thing we're going to do is come back over here and look at our recipes controller, and we'll add a def show. And this is going to render a single recipe. So this will just do recipe.find, and then it's going to pull in the params, which you have when you're working with a Rails request. And then in the route, it's going to have an ID. And the way you can see this in action is if we do rake routes again. And you look right here to this :ID portion. This is an actual value that's going to be passed from the route into the params hash, and we can access it from inside of the controller. Now that we have that, we can create a new view for ourselves. So we go into recipes, create a new file. This is going to be show html.erb. And this is going to be very similar to our index, except for it's going to show less information. So in here, we're going to have the h1 render out the recipe name. And then we'll put in h2 for the description. Then we'll put our description in a paragraph tag again. And then down here, we're going to add some more actions in a div because we need to be able to do a few things. So this will be recipe action. And this is actually going to be really similar to what's in the index. So I'm going to actually come over here and steal this. Oops, this UL. So we'll come in here and paste that. And the only addition that we're going to have here is that we want a link that's going to go back. It just says back. And this will take you to the recipes, plural, path. And then we do have to make a small tweak in here, and that is, since we're not working with a recipe yielded from a block anymore, we're going to have to call it using the @. Okay, now if we come back to our view and we click this, let's see what happens. Hey, there we go. So it renders out the individual recipe page. So that was pretty fast. These show types are really easy to do. Index and show are pretty simple. Next one we're going to work on is actually going to be the delete portion, and that's just because it's really easy. We already did all the work. When you click this, it renders this box, and when you click OK, it's going to blow up because there is no destroy action. So we just need to build that destroy action. So if we come back to our controller, we'll add it down here. And the way destroy works is we're going to find the recipe. We don't need it to be an instance variable because we're not going to render a view. And this will just take recipe.find, params ID again. And then we want to call recipe.destroy. Destroy will go through and it'll delete the row, but it'll also run any callback functions that might exist. We're not going to probably write any callbacks because they're kind of a pain to deal with later on in an application's lifecycle. But this is why you call destroy instead of just delete. And then what we want to do is we want to redirect to the recipes path. And then we want to give a notice. And this notice will be in the flash messages, which we actually added to our layout, so it'll always be rendered. And we'll just say that we deleted the recipe, and then we can actually use the recipe again. So we'll say recipe.name here. And the reason we can use this is because even though we called destroy here, that deletes the database row. So on the next page render, it's going to hit this recipe all, read everything from the database, and it's just the row is not going to exist, so it's not going to be read into here. But as of right now, we still have this recipe object in memory, so we can still call methods on it. So we'll save that, go back to our browser, and then we'll hit this delete. And so leggings, meditation, YOLO Thundercats is what we're going to expect to be missing, but the ID of 1. So if we delete this, we come back, there's no YOLO Thundercats. And the first ID, if you look at down at the bottom corner there, what is showing up is a 2. So we successfully added our delete, and it didn't take that much. It took like 4 or 5 lines of code. Moving along, we're going to go on to the new portion. So if we click new now, it's going to fail because there is no new action. So we will add def new, whoops. And then this is going to take a recipe, and this is just going to call recipe.new. Oh man, this tab completion is really bad. There we go. And then we need to create our view again. So if we come over and create a new file, this will be new.html.erb. One of the beautiful things about new and create and edit and update is that they're basically the same thing, and it's just working with a different type of recipe. So in our new and create, we're working with a recipe that doesn't exist yet. And edit and update, we're working with one that does, and we just need to change it. But the form will be the same, and the actual actions that we build will be basically the same, except for instead of calling new to create a new recipe, we will call find to find one, and then just adjust the attributes on it. So what that allows us to do is have really simple views for new and edit. So we'll set this up, and this will just say new recipe in our H1. And then down here, we will say render partial form. And so we're using the equal sign in this. I call this a bee sting. I have no idea where I picked that up, but if you hear me say bee sting, that's what I'm talking about. And so we're actually going to take whatever the result is of this, and we're going to drop it into this page. And so this gets us to partial views. And partial views are a cool way to abstract out pieces of the view that you're going to reuse multiple times or in multiple different views. So that's what we're going to do with this form. So inside of recipes, We're going to create a new file, and partials start with an underscore. So this is going to be underscore form.html.arb. And this is going to be the most complicated view that we're going to build throughout this entire thing. So we're going to have quite a few different things going on. We're going to expect that there's going to be an errors, and if it exists, we want to show it. So we'll use an if statement here. And inside this if statement, we'll have a div with a class of errors. And underneath here, we will put a UL. And in this UL, we will take every error that exists. So errors, each do error. And we will render out this error. We'll put it in LI. Next up, we're going to create our form. And Rails gives us a lot of different things. So, I mean, we've already used the link to helper in order to build out anchors for us, but it gives us some even better things when it comes to forms. It gives us form builders. So we're going to say form for recipe do, and then we'll call this form. And you notice that this also has an equals, and that's because it needs to return a form tag and the contents included. So in here, we'll have some classes. This will be a form group. I'm actually going to copy this because we need two of them. And then we'll start from the bottom up. So we'll say div class, we'll call this actions. This is where we're going to put our form submit button, which is just going to say submit. Or it's just going to be submit, but it's not going to say submit. And that's one of the cool things that this form builder is going to give us, so that I'll show you here in a second. In our first form group, we're going to create a form label for name. And then we're going to also create a form text field for name. And then we'll copy these two things, come down here and paste them, and this will change to description. And then it's not going to be a text field anymore, it's going to be a text area, because description is going to have a lot more text in it. Okay, take a look at our controller. We have our new action already. So if we bounce back over here and we refresh the page, it's going to render out our form. It's not pretty, but it does work. So one of the things I want to bring your attention to is our submit button. Notice it says create recipe, even though we didn't tell it to do that at all. And the reason for that is because of how the form builder works. When you say form for recipe, it's going to look at this recipe and it's going to ask it, like, are you persisted or not? And if it is persisted, it'll say, oh, you're creating something new. Or if it's not persisted, it'll say you're creating something new. If it is persisted, it's going to say, oh, you want to, you're editing this. So it'll actually change the text of this form based on whether or not this is persisted. And it actually, you'll notice we'd never even tell this form what the action should be, like which URL it should post to, or that it should even post at all. And that's because form will also look at active record for that. And so if it's not persisted, it'll assume you want to go to the create action. And if it is persisted, it thinks you want to go to the update. Form builders are really handy. Our next thing is going to be to work on the create action, which is what new is going to post to. So in here, we need to create the recipe again. We need to fetch it here. So this is going to be recipe.new, and then we're going to create a method here called recipe params. And then we'll write the rest of this, and then we'll bounce back to that particular method. So if recipe.save, else end, and then we'll do the else first here. So if it fails, we want to get the errors, which are going to come from the recipe, all of the errors, and then getting the full messages just so that we can easily display them. Then we want to render the new action from up above, or it's actually going to render the new view. So if it does succeed in saving, we're going to redirect to the recipe path with our own recipe. And then we'll also pass through a flash notice of recipe created. So save that. We need to define this recipe params. So we're going to create a private method in here. And what this is actually for is params is a special type of object that behaves like a hash, but it's not actually a hash. And it's everything that is submitted from the form. Well, you don't always want to take everything that's submitted. Like, people can go in and they can edit the HTML to submit more than what you actually put on the page originally. So what this gives us is we can create a method that wraps and uses the Rails strong parameters. And that will allow us to, we need to require that there's a recipe as part of the form. And then we're going to permit some specific attributes from being sent. So we're going to allow them to send us name and allow them to send us description. But if they send us anything more than that, we're going to ignore it. All right, now let's go back, and we put all that effort into showing you these errors. So let's see what actually happens. We know that if there is no name and there is no description, it should give some errors. So if we hit create recipe, it's going to go and submit, and it gives us all of our errors printed out nicely. But issues right here. User must exist, user can't be blank. And you might have noticed this in what we've been building thus far, and that's that we're not even signed in and we can see all this stuff. But one of our things is you shouldn't be able to see recipes that aren't yours. So if you're not signed in, how do you see any recipes at all? So this is where it comes into the authentication side of things. We have to button down our recipes controller and make sure that the user can only see the recipes if they're signed in, for one thing, but then that they can only see their own recipes once they're signed in. Thankfully, Clearance has got our back on this. So if we come back over and we take a look at our controller again, we can come up here and we can create a before action, which this is a method that's going to run before the action is ever hit. And this will be require login. So if we just save with just that as the change, and we come back to recipes new, you'll notice that it redirects us right back to the sign-in page. So that worked. You can no longer get to the normal recipes either. That'll take you back to sign in. So cool. So we'll sign in using the user that we created in our seeds file. And then this gets us back to the recipes. That's cool. And now we can look at recipes new again. The next thing is we want it to only allow you to access recipes that you already own. And we're going to use that by getting rid of all the places where we call recipe with a capital R. So recipe, capital R, all is going to turn into current user, which is a method that holds on to the person that is currently logged in, dot recipes. And then where we say recipe.find, we're going to turn that into current user recipes.find. So I'll do that here. And then recipe.new is going to turn into current user recipes build. So we'll do that down here too. Okay, and that covers our bases. Everything should be current user related now. If we go back and we try to look at the recipes to make sure this all works, it's actually going to fail. And the reason it fails is because current user doesn't even know that it has recipes, but that's really, really easy to fix, thankfully. So you'll remember that the recipe model itself actually has the data for which user it belongs to. User doesn't store that because it has many of those things, and we can't have a column on it for every one of them. But it does, we can add the has many recipes on here. And what this will do is it'll do a query saying, I know my user ID, find me every recipe that has the associated user ID that matches my own ID. And that will fix this issue. So now we can call user.recipes and it'll give us a list. So going back to creating a new one, let's just try this out. Test recipe. This is a test. We submit it. Hey, the recipe is created. Gives us everything here. We go back and we come down to the bottom and you can see that we're good to go. So the next thing we need to build is edit and update. I mentioned before that edit and update are going to be pretty much identical to what we did for creating, and you're going to see now just what that's like. So first thing and we need to do is actually create our edit view. So this will be edit html.arb. And here we're going to have an H1 that says edit recipe. And then we're going to actually do the same thing we did in the new. And that's going to be render partial form. So if we come back over and we go to edit, it's actually going to fail. We need to go to our controller and create our action. So we'll just come down here underneath create, def edit, recipe. And this will take current user recipes, find params ID, And then we're going to actually go ahead and just create this, but we'll get to it in a second. So now if I click this edit, it'll take us in here and it shows us edit recipe and renders out the form. And then you'll notice that it actually subs in the value for the object. So this is the other thing the form builder does for you, is that when you go through and you say that, it sets the value to whatever exists. When you create a new recipe though, it doesn't have a name, so it's just an empty string, and that just works out perfectly for us. So what we can do here is change this to test edit. And you'll notice that it also says update recipe down here, which is really cool. So let's go back and create our update action so that when we submit this, it's going to actually work out. So for this, I'm actually going to completely copy create and just paste it in here. And then what we're going to do is we're going to perform the find like we did in edit, because it needs to exist. Params ID. And then instead of calling save, what we actually call is update attributes. And then we'll pass in recipe params again, so that we get the benefit of strong parameters. And instead of created, we'll say updated. And down here, instead of new, we're going to say edit. But you'll notice that the shape of the create method and the shape of the update method are exactly the same, with the exceptions of like how we find the original recipe and how we save. And then beyond that, it's just whether or not you're doing new, edit, create, or update. So if we save this now and we come back and we actually post this, it actually changed it. So now the name of our recipe is test edit. If we go back, you'll see down here that it did do one weird thing here, and that is that it put it at the bottom. So this is recipe with the ID of 16. This is recipe with the ID of 21. I would think 21 would either come way at the front or way at the end. So that shows me that we do have an ordering thing that we can fix. So that's up here in our index. Let's just order this by ID instead of by most recently updated. So now if we reload this, you'll see that test edit does not come at the end. It comes kind of smack dab in the middle because it was our 16th. This is 17, 18, etc. So there you go. We've gone through and we've deleted, created, viewed, and yeah, that's it. The entire crud of working with our recipes. And the user can only see the recipes that he or she owns. So we've effectively built out a recipe book. So we can't do the meal planning side of things just yet, but we do have a catalog of recipes that a user can have and manage. I hope that you liked this tutorial and that it was beneficial for you. I'm excited for how fast we're kind of going through these features. And in the next tutorial, we're actually going to build out our meal plan. So we're going to take all of the recipes that we have and create a way to randomly generate a plan for a week, given that you don't duplicate the same recipe twice. If you like this, give it a thumbs up and share it on social media, and I'd stick around to learn some more.